Their commanding officer committed suicide. Interesting, sort of. Only the Bolsheviks really gained from the episode. Their leaders were let out of jail, and their followers were armed to defend Petrograd. So they give the armed thugs more guns and say, take care of Petrograd, we want you to protect it from this uprising. And the uprising was to do away with the Soviets and go back to old ways. After the Kornilov threat collapsed, the Soviets retained the preponderance of military strength in the capital, winning ever more adherents among the increasingly radical masses. So the Soviets out of this fiasco look like the people who protected the government from a takeover of the old order, the people who want autocracy back. And so it's bad that they gained, it's unfortunate that people couldn't see far enough ahead that the tactics of these people were not something they wanted to be involved with, but they didn't see that. Now, what they call the October Revolution. The Bolsheviks finally captured a majority in the Petrograd Soviet on September 13th and in the Moscow Soviet a week later. Throughout the country, the Bolsheviks were on the rise. From his hideout in Finland, Lenin urged the seizure of power. On October 23rd, he came incognito to Petrograd. Now, they start trying to set up their government, and it turns out that Leon Trotsky, quote, proved to be Lenin's most able and most active assistant in staging the Bolsheviks' seizure of power, end quote. Interesting point for those who think that Lenin was a nice guy, and if he could have taken over, or if he could have stayed in power instead of Stalin, that would be great. But above all, Trotsky should have been in power. That's like Hitchens was a Trotskyite. Trotsky was right there, hand in hand with Lenin from the very beginning. Lenin found out very early on that Trotsky was the man to have for brutally forcing your way into power, murder at a time, one murder by another. Quote, the revolution succeeded with little opposition. On November 7th, or October 25th on the old-style calendar, that's why they call it the October Revolution, Red troops occupied various strategic points in the capital. In the early night hours of November 8th, the Bolshevik-led soldiers of the Petrograd garrison, sailors from Kronstadt, the Workers' Red Guards, all stormed the Winter's Palace, weakly defended by youngsters from military schools and even by a women's battalion. So they storm the Winter Palace and arrest members of the provisional government. So, Soviet government was established in Petrograd and in Russia, end quote, by force. There we go. They didn't tarry long in using their power once they got even more power and more recognition from the people. And Lenin said, let's seize power. They just went in and took over the place where the government meets by force. Now, I'll remind you that they simply seized power in the capital, Petrograd. They didn't necessarily seize power across the entire nation, and there will be pockets of opposition now, of course. Quote, although the Bolsheviks seized power easily in November 1917, they managed to consolidate their new position only after several years of bitter struggle. In addition to waging a major and many-faceted civil war, the Soviet government had to fight Poland and deal with the Allied intervention. The Bolsheviks, in a desperate effort to survive, mobilized the population and resources in the area that they controlled and instituted a drastic regime which came to be known as war communism. I paused for a second there. Ayn Rand lived through some of this, and she said the one thing that you noticed was that whether it was the red flags or the white flags flying, really there was no difference in life. Everyone was poor, everything was scarce, it was a terrible time. Didn't matter which flag you were flying under. Didn't make any difference. Now, in the first few months of what becomes the Civil War, quote, in Moscow, Soviet authority was established only after a week of fighting because some military units remained loyal to the provisional government. Relying on local Soviets, the Bolsheviks spread their rule to numerous other towns and areas. The first serious challenge to the Bolshevik government occurred in January 1918, when the Constituent Assembly, for which elections had been held in the autumn, finally met. The 707 members who assembled in the capital on January 18th included 370 socialist revolutionaries, 40 of this other group, 170 this, 34 Mensheviks, and 100 deputies. So there's a big mix of different political mindsets and parties here. Now this is what people have been waiting for, this assembly to get together, because it legitimizes the government. Everyone's basically up, everyone but the Soviets, but the Russian, the Bolshevik, Soviet communists, everyone besides them is waiting for this government to begin its evolution towards freedom. But so this was, the country was awaiting the assembly. Now what happens when the Soviets have seized power and these Johnny-come-latelys start assembling as if they are a government, as if they're going to be helping share power or something like that? Do you think Lenin was amused? Quote, Lenin himself had denounced the provisional government for failing to summon it promptly, for failing to get this whole get-together promptly. So Lenin early on said, the provisional government sucks. It's not holding its elections. It's not getting a constituent assembly together. Fine. Finally, they get the assembly together. Quote, in the changed circumstances, Lenin acted in his usual decisive manner and had troops disperse the Constituent Assembly on the morning of the 19th of January. So before he said, you guys deserve an election, you deserve to have a say in your government. Fine, the government gets together. He says, send some men with guns over there. Arrest some people. Tell them to go home. Now, what if that would have turned to riots in the streets and people said, we elected those people, goddammit, let them meet? What would have happened? Or what if the provisional government would have called all of its troops? Any troop loyal had to come, was summoned into Petrograd or Moscow. But, quote, no major repercussions followed, and the Soviet rule appeared more secure than ever. So they just dispersed an elected assembly with guns. And everyone's just like, oh crap. And that's that. Now, the Soviet government, as Lenin was fond of doing, was making all kinds of promises, so maybe that's part of the reason that they let the Soviets keep power. The Soviets had said, we're going to end the war with the Germans through whatever concessions we need to. We're going to give land to peasants. It's going to be freedom, bread, happiness, all that great stuff. And so maybe that's part of the reason that people said, well, they've promised us a lot. They're acting like thugs, but they've promised us a lot. So let's let them give it to us. And instead of taking responsibility for yourself in your life and saying, I've got to figure it out for myself, you say, no, they've promised it to me, I'll wait around and let them hand me something. Like Benjamin Franklin said, if you'll trade your freedom for security, then in the end you won't have either one. You'll have no freedom and you'll be completely insecure. And that's what they were willing to do. They were willing to trade freedoms for security, for freedom and bread and peace, instead of the right to vote. Now, in December 1917, they conclude an armistice with the German government. Now, the Western governments hadn't recognized this Soviet communist get-together, but Germany was willing to. So they have an armistice. After that, the front just disbands, just dissolves, and the soldiers just try to get home from the front however they can. And Trotsky meets with the Germans to try to work out the peace treaty. And the Germans had wanted extreme measures, very draconian measures for the peace. They said, well, you're going to have to give us this, 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 and this. Quote, Trotsky, who as Commissar of Foreign Affairs represented the Soviet government, felt compelled